Hello and welcome to this training on how to draft a privacy notice. My name is Maria Rebinder and I'm a legal counsel working for Aalto University.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Annina Harju, and just like Maria, I also work at Aalto University as a legal counsel. And special welcome for everyone who also joined our previous webinar about processing personal data in research. So today our topic is specializing in how to draft a privacy notice.
Yeah. And we'll both, I'll start and then Annina can comment if she has some extra advice. So let's get started without further ado. The duty to inform participants is in the GDPR, and it's also a research ethics requirement. This privacy notice tells how the personal data, so it's addressing you, the research participant, how your personal data will be used in the research study. And here you complete, in all the gray areas, you complete, or in these areas where they are in, you complete, for example, here the research study name. So this privacy notice must be provided to research participants before collecting their personal data. And if you have a project website, that should be there. For example, in EU projects, we have this privacy notice in the EU project website, and then, of course, provided also upon request. But it's important that the research participants get this before the data is collected. And this notice is applicable for research where Aalto University is the controller and research is conducted by researchers who are employed at Aalto University. So then Aalto University is controller. And if there are visiting researchers, then it's case by case. And for master students, we have this policy that master students are actually, as persons, controllers of their own data. So this would be needing many alterations. So we are now concentrating today on a scenario where you are an Aalto University employee and Aalto University is the controller of personal data.
Yes, and we also have a specific template for our students. So if you are a student and processing personal data as part of your master's thesis, for example, you can contact us and ask for a specific template for that purpose. So please don't use this template because we have a better working template also for you.
Yeah, and it's very important that you feel this carefully. This is not an agreement, but it gives the relevant information to the person who is participating. And this is a promise, and it's a binding promise on how the data will be used. And so draft this carefully. And of course, before drafting this, you must plan the entire life cycle of the research data containing, or of course, research data in general, as you do in the data management plan, and then especially the research data containing personal data. So this, for example, limits how the personal data can be used in the future and how it can be shared with, for example, other researchers and other universities. And these gray areas in the Aalto University template are then the instructions are then, of course, removed before sending this to the participants. And we legal counsels, we can advise, but it's the researchers of the research project who have to plan the use of research data and write this. So you have to know, and of course you do know what you will be doing with the research data. And we have a lot of guidance for you on the Aalto University website about the duty to provide information. So there's a legal obligation and about how to handle personal data in research. So let's go to section 1. So what's being studied in this research study and the purpose of processing personal data? So give a few sentences what you are examining in this research study and a very brief summary. You can tell more about the research in the participant information sheet. And please be careful that in the participant information sheet, you can talk about the research study and the methodology and the practical things like where the participant should be, how long the interview is planned to take, and these things. But don't there write about personal data, and here don't write about the practical matters. So don't ever write about the exact same thing in two different documents, in two different wordings, because this is a common mistake, and then you probably end up with conflicting information. So the personal data will be handled here. And if you have a research funder, name it here. If not, just enter Aalto University as the funder. And then, so this is easy. Now, section 2. What personal data is processed? So this information that has to be given is regulated in the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the binding legislation in all EU countries, and also UK has very similar legislation. So first, think through, as I said, you have planned the use of research data, and you think through how are you going to use the personal data during the research process. For example, first you need the contact information, for example, to send a questionnaire or to agree on interviews. Then you have the consent form. We will talk later about that. And then, so first, the practical matters already require using personal data. And then you describe the research data containing personal data. And that can be, for example, questionnaire answers, interview answers. So please note that if you are doing an interview and a questionnaire where you have open questions where the questionnaire, they can write something, and when it's not, of course, there are some, for example, web questionnaires, which might be able, if they're very, very simple and you just click some answers, you might be able to avoid personal data, but I have not yet come across that. So usually survey answers and interview answers are personal data, even if you don't collect any other personal data in the research study. So the concept of personal data is very wide in the European Union. Then, of course, audio and video recordings are personal data. Also the transcribed version, if the wording comes from the participants, so it's personal wording. Findings or notes made by the researcher about the research participant can be personal data. And then, of course, images, for example, brain images, and measurement data, for example, heart rate, and location data of the participant, for example, where the participant has been located during a day or a week. That usually gives their home address, their work address, their hobbies, their religious activities, and so on. And then the GDPR regulates special categories of personal data. And you have to specifically name these categories of personal data. If you don't have these categories, here you choose option 1, especially protected personal data will not be processed. And if you do have the special category data, then you choose option 2. Unfortunately, the GDPR is drafted so that it reads racial or ethnic origin. Of course, we all know in university that races do not exist, but this is how it's written in the legislation, and this is the ethnic origin. So many of the studies would, for example, be concerning, for example, immigrants, could be handling special category data. And then data concerning sexual orientation or person's sex life. So, for example, any research that is especially centered on sexual minorities, for example, that would be then special category data. And then data concerning health. So we are not now talking about clinical studies, but if there is data concerning health collected in other than medical studies, then that's also special category data. And so these have to be listed, and they also affect the legal basis, which we will discuss later. And then where is the data collected from? Usually the main source is the participants. That's why the participants are there. So interviews, questionnaires, workshops, and then there can be data registers, for example, the Finnish Population Information System, and other research data from previous studies, and so on. And anything that the participant doesn't directly give or tell, that has to be listed here. And then the research methods, again, would be described in the participant information sheet, where you discuss the other things that are not personal data processing.
Yeah, here I can maybe add a little bit more about the source of the personal data. So in most cases, we see that people really list that everything is collected from the participant. So if they are using different types of measurement tools, for example, obviously the person is not going to be able to tell themselves that, oh yeah, what is my heartbeat at the moment? It's physically collected from the participant, but because the participant is not able to tell it him or herself directly, it needs to go into the category of other means. So basically, if you're using like any tools to measure like heartbeat, skin temperature, anything like that, you need to remember to list it here to other category where the data is being collected from.
Yeah, that's very important. And then how are you going to process it? So GDPR doesn't prohibit the use of personal data. On the contrary, it encourages it, and especially for scientific research. So you can process personal data, and never write something like all data will be anonymous and we will not process personal data just because you think that that's the way you really now comply with legislation, that you are not using personal data. Anonymization is very difficult to achieve. So if you are gathering data from or of persons, you are gathering personal data, and it's perfectly okay. What is required is that you describe what you are going to do with the data. So transparency is what's required, and this is where the place where you tell transparently and clearly and concretely what data how you process the data. So if you remove identifiers, tell what identifiers you remove. For example, that you don't give the specific address, you only have the region, for example, the postal code, and name the identifiers that are removed. And any of these example texts, don't copy these. I mean, the only thing you should leave are the names of the different sections, so the headings, and then describe only what you actually do. So this is not an agreement that you should not change. This is not a university agreement template that you should not change. This is exactly in clear and concise language describe what you're actually going to do with the personal data, and describe it here. And pseudonymization is very much recommended. So if you can use pseudonymized data instead of real identifiers, please do. That's absolutely recommended. But remember that pseudonymized data is still personal data. And data minimization is recommended, but in scientific research, only to the degree that you don't minimize the data to death. So you don't kill. So you can keep all the necessary data you need for the information, for the research, scientific research purpose. So don't remove necessary information, but if there is unnecessary information, then that has to be removed. And that's, as a researcher, you are the one who knows what you will be needing for the research. So transparency about what you are actually going to do. And of course, this requires planning the research data management well. And one common thing that you can remove is that if you are, for example, studying the behavior in a workplace, in an organization, but during the interview, the person interviewed wishes to tell something sensitive about their private life, which is not actually in the scope of your in the study, and that is somehow recorded in the interview, then of course all of these things have to be removed because they were not part of the planned personal data. So remove those as soon as possible. And that's an example of unnecessary data. And of course, the easiest thing about personal data is planning. So don't collect data that you will not need. So you don't have to go through the process of then removing unnecessary data. So think about, for example, the interview questions and survey questions quite carefully, which of course you will do. So usually when the interview data is transcribed, then it can be that, for example, audio files are then processed for a certain time or used for a certain time, and then you are left with only the transcribed interview data in written form. So then you can delete the original voice recording, because of course that voice recording is then unnecessary personal data. And if you don't need identifiers that the interviewed person reveals, those extra identifiers, like they mentioned, something that you don't need for your research, remove that as you are transcribing it, for example. And yes, then there are, of course, the rough classification of survey data. For example, age range is usually sufficient, so you don't need to ask if somebody is 58 years old. If it's enough to say that their age is between 55 and 60. And this also helps to keep the data pseudonymized. So, for example, in a workplace, the exact age can already directly identify who that person is. So plan the data minimization when you are planning the questions, and use, for example, the age range if you don't, for some reason, need the exact year they were born.
Yeah, so maybe just to clarify the structure of the section 3. So basically what we have done is that we have written for you some general examples. So for example, this first chapter is applicable to most of the research studies, but you always need to really carefully read everything through and consider if this is applicable for your exact research study. And all these that Maria just listed, all these means of sort of like minimizing the collected personal data, you need to go through these examples and see if any of these is applicable for your research study. For example, are you transcribing the audio? If yes, you can use this text. And then if a participant relieves some directly identifiable information, are you deleting that in the transcription phase? If yes, then again, you can use this phrase. So you need to really, you can't just use every one of the examples if it's not applicable for your case. And for example, if you are collecting video footage of the participants and you are blurring their faces and making the video pseudonymized as well, then you can use this phrase. And the last example is about the publication that is made from the study. So in vast majority of cases, the identity of the participant will not be disclosed. So based on just reading the scientific article, it's not possible to recognize who the participant in the study is, like an individual participant. But we have also studies where this is not possible. So basically, if the interview is a public person, for example, let's say like President of Finland, obviously it can be very relevant and you need to disclose that President of Finland has been participant in this study or has given views on certain topics. So in that case, obviously everyone knows who is President of Finland. So if you disclose this information in the publication, then of course you are revealing the identity of the research participant. And that's fine, but you really need to consider this before you start collecting the data. And if this is the case that you are revealing person's title or workplace or position, and it can be recognizable from the publication, you need to inform the participant. So again, be transparent, be very clear so that the participant understands that they may be recognizable from the publication.
Yeah, because if you're doing expert interviews, and it's very important to state that this is the title and this is the organization or the type of organization, for example, a community, a building company, and the title, in order to understand the viewpoint of the expert interview. And for example, you are doing a study on use of color in architecture. You can interview architects and artists and community planners and so on, and have their names and photos. So it's very case specific what you can do with the personal data. So plan it carefully, and if you wish to state the, for example, title and organization of the person, then you have to explain that to the person interviewed. And sometimes, for example, when you have workshops and what they produce is, for example, drawings, you can have them in the consent form, different options if they want to be named as the author of the drawing, if they want to be named with their real name, if they want to use a pseudonym, or if they want to be anonymous. So again, plan carefully, be transparent. Practically nothing is forbidden except lying to the participant. That is forbidden. So never copy any of these examples if they don't apply to you. Again, sometimes, I mean, it's in a way very nice that you think that somebody might think that, well, lawyers have drafted this and we must copy it, but this is not that kind of document. These are meant as examples, and we have been asked to provide examples. We have done that, but these are just examples and not meant to be copied anyway, but as a guidance of things that you might find useful if they apply to your case. But write it, and you don't have to use legalese in writing this. Write in plain Finnish, English, Swedish, whatever language you use. And that's actually a requirement of the GDPR, that the information to participants must be clear and concise. And then we come to the legal basis. Then I must remind you that this is for studies where Aalto University is the controller, and we are therefore using the Finnish national legislation. The GDPR Article 6 lists different legal bases that can be used for research. One of them is consent, and then explicit consent for special category data. As I said, the special category personal data processing, for example, health data, sexual orientation, ethnic background, then requires the specific legal basis of explicit consent. And then there is possibility in GDPR Article 6 that the member states, for example, Finland, may legislate in national legislation that a task in the public interest, for example, scientific research, can be the legal basis for processing of data. And Finland has chosen to legislate this. So for the cases where you can use this template, Aalto University's controller, and you are employed by Aalto University, you can choose as the legal basis that it's scientific research, a task in the public interest. And this affects your ability to use the research data and also it ensures we haven't had if we haven't had much use for the consent, but it's also used. But usually we use this because with the consent we have the problem that it can be whenever the person wants, they can change their mind, and this consent must be able to be withdrawn as easily as it was given. And if the consent is withdrawn, you no longer have a legal basis for the use of personal data. So therefore, for scientific research, we usually advise, if you can, use this scientific research task in the public interest as the legal basis. But this is for researchers employed by the Aalto University.
Yeah, so there are, in the GDPR, there are many other options as well. So these are not the only ones that GDPR has listed, but we try to make this easy for you and only provide 2 options. So in most of the cases, if you are at least doctoral student, you are employed by Aalto University, or you are a master's student working in a professional research group, in those cases, always choose scientific research as your legal basis. What we really receive a lot is the kind of privacy notices where consent has been chosen, because people really easily mix sort of like the ethical consent. So obviously you need to ask consent to participate to the research, but if you're asking the consent, it doesn't mean that you have to use consent as legal basis of processing the personal data. So if you're asking consent, it doesn't mean that you need to tick the second box and use consent as basis for processing the personal data. So be really careful and try to choose the first option, which is scientific research. And the second one, it's not the same as asking consent to participate.
Yeah, this is a bit tricky part, that the consent to participate is different from the legal base of processing personal data. But this is the reality, and we'll discuss this a bit later when we discuss the consent. So we have tried to explain it here, but this is one of the more difficult parts of the combination of the legal aspects and the ethical aspects, which usually the ethical aspects are wider than what's legally required in many instances. And this is here also, that even if you don't need consent as legal basis, because legal basis is scientific research, then you still need consent to participate, because in scientific research, participation has to be voluntary, and they have to be informed that they have they can voluntarily choose to participate or not.
Yes.
So now I give the floor to Annina.
Yes, thank you, Maria. Okay, so the next section, number 5, is about sharing the personal data. This looks like a really long and scary one, but let's go through it together and see what you actually need to fill in here. So basically, this means situations where you are transferring the data outside Aalto University. So someone else than Aalto personnel is processing or having access to your data. So you don't need to list persons here who are employed by Aalto. So for example, you don't need to list your supervisor, you don't need to list your legal counsel, nothing like that. So we're only interested about parties outside Aalto University. So for example, researchers who are employed by some other university. So for example, University of Helsinki researchers. We're interested in companies, for example, who provide us some kind of services, for example, transcription services. So only outside third parties. And the second thing that it's really important to remember when you start filling this in is that also pseudonymized data is regarded as personal data. Because what we hear really often is that when researchers are transferring the data to their collaborators in some other university, they say that, well, I'm only transferring the pseudonymized data. I'm not transferring the participants' direct identifiers, their names or emails, so that should be fine. But unfortunately, under the current interpretation, also this data that the other university receives without the direct identifiers, it's still regarded as personal data. And let's remind you what pseudonymized personal data means. So it's personal data in a form where the person is not directly identifiable, but with combining it with other information you or other parties may have, for example, the code key, the consent forms, the names, the emails, the personal data set becomes identifiable again. So it's still regarded as personal data because a single individual can be identified from the data. Okay, so let's start seeing the first section. So option 1 is the easiest one. So personal data processed in this study will not be shared with third parties. So this applies in cases where only Aalto's personnel will process the data. So basically only researchers employed by Aalto will have access to the data. So then you just choose the option 1. Option 2 is that in case you have another controller who you act as joint controllers with, for example, I use the University of Helsinki again. So we have some studies where Aalto University and University of Helsinki act as joint controllers, and only the joint controllers will process the personal data. In those cases as well, we're able to say that no third parties are processing the personal data, and only the joint controllers will process the personal data. Because the controller obviously always has right and will process the personal data, so you don't need to list the controllers specifically if only the controllers are processing the personal data.
Yeah.
We will come back to the joint controllers in section 10.
Yeah, we will. The joint controllers are, of course, named and listed in section 10.
Yes. And then option 3 is that you are transferring or sharing some personal data with third parties, so outside Aalto parties. And then we have instructions. Please see the options and instructions below. Okay, then the first option is independent controllers. So under GDPR, you must figure out a role for each party. So basically our options are controller, joint controller, independent controller, and processor. This can be very confusing. So if you're really unsure, you can always contact us and we will help you to determine which are the right roles in your case. But yeah, for example, here you can list other universities or research institutions, companies or other third parties who you share your research data with, but if they act as independent controllers. Then another option is, because in some rare cases, some scientific publications may require you to share the data as part of the peer review process. It's quite rare that anything regarded as personal data would actually need to be shared, but we actually recommend using this clause just to be on the safe side. So just to make sure that in case there is such requirement, you can actually share the data.
Yeah, and for these purposes, you can, for example, have the data with restricted access, for example, in Zenodo, and then give the restricted access to, for example, the publisher for this purpose. But yeah, I have also not, but some, if they have the underlying requirement, if they have a data policy that requires that the underlying data is available, then this might be the case.
Yes. And in this independent controller subsection, the last bit is about using the personal data for further research. So this is a bit tricky one because this is at the moment a little bit in the gray area. So we're not really sure. So if we use this clause that we may use the data for further research in the same scientific discipline that support this research study, and we also may transfer it to other universities, we're not really sure at the moment how this kind of clause would be interpreted in practice. So if it would be actually okay to use the data and share it with other parties as well, just based on this very general clause, but we have included it anyway, just to sort of like try our best, because in many cases there are high interest to exploit the data in further research as well. And it's impossible to know at this stage if this would be something that it's interesting, if the data set is really high value and interested to continue working with. So if you're not sure, if you would like to do some further research, you can include this clause as well. Then the personal data processors. So this role is slightly different. This mostly applies to different, for example, service providers. So if you use some external service providers to help with your data, for example, the most common example is the transcription service. And if you're not really sure yet if you're going to use an external transcription service provider, we recommend that you would include this clause anyway to mention that we may use third-party service providers in transcribing personal data, because we've had several cases where the researcher have just simply listed that, no, we will not use any third-party service providers. We will only process the personal data at Aalto University, and then they have realized how massive work the transcription is, and they would like to use a third-party service provider. So what we recommend that if you're not sure, it's not dangerous if you include clause that we may use this kind of service provider. You can just include it just to be on the safe side, that if you on a later date would like to use some kind of help with the transcription phase, because the audio tapes are regarded as directly identifier personal data. So therefore, they are regarded obviously as personal data because you can directly identify a person from an audio tape.
Yeah, so don't overpromise, and that's close to the don't lie, which we already discussed. So think of the potential uses, and there has been some old forms where it stated something like only these researchers, and with even names, will process the data, and these have proved very fatal. So be careful what you promise, plan the data life cycle, and be prepared to the situation where you have actually created a very high value data set, which is important for continuing the research, because the GDPR recitals actually state that it could be used for further research in some cases, which we have stated here. But we are still waiting for the European Data Protection Board recommendations for the use or guidance for scientific research. And until we receive that, we are not absolutely sure, but this is still in line with the GDPR recitals. So I think we can include that if it's relevant.
Yeah, and one question that I receive quite often is that the research groups are not yet sure, for example, who the collaborators will be, so that when they are drafting this privacy notice, they are not yet sure that which researchers from which universities will be collaborating and will need access to the data. So we've had cases where we have actually solved this issue as well. So you can basically just be transparent and write that this is highly collaborative study, but you don't know the collaborators yet. But once you have the information who will be participating to the study and accessing the data, you will update the privacy notice. But in that case, it's very important that you need to tell the participants where they are able to find the updated privacy notice. So what's a really good option is to upload the privacy notice online and give them the link so that they can anytime access the updated privacy notice and see if there are any updates about the collaborators. Because it's really common that in the research projects, it's really hard to predict all the single researchers and universities who will be collaborating to the study. But if you have such case, please do not write that no personal data will be shared outside Aalto University, because then it gets really difficult. If the data has been collected, you have promised that the data will not be shared outside Aalto, and then you have an interesting collaborator who would need access to the data. So it's really hard to again try to inform the participants, because you have not given them any information like about the upcoming updates or where they can find the updated privacy notice. Because in most cases, the researchers, they just give the privacy notice, collect the data, and then it's gone, basically. So they don't have this ongoing communication with the participants. So in that case, it's really difficult to actually share the data with any new parties that have not been mentioned or listed in the privacy notice. And as Mario mentioned, never use names. You don't need to list each researcher by name, and we recommend that you don't do it because it's too strict. You can just say that researchers from Tampere University, from University of Helsinki, so you can just refer to the university where the researchers are affiliated with, so you don't need to list them by their name. Okay, then we're going to continue with sharing and transferring the data. So GDPR has quite strict rules on transferring the data outside European Union or European Economic Area. So basically, the reason behind this is obviously that once we go outside European Union, GDPR is no longer applied, and those countries may not provide as strict and good privacy legislation as we have here in the EU. So obviously the data is not as protected as it's when it's located here or processed here inside European Union. So again, you need to know. So before you start processing and collecting the personal data, you will need to know if you are transferring it to parties outside European Union. So for example, if your funder requires that you will need to, your funder is from United States and they are most definitely requiring you to transfer, for example, the pseudonymized personal data to the US, you will need to know it at this point because you need to know the exact country, because we have a list of the countries where European Commission has made these adequacy decisions. So this is a list of countries where basically European Commission thinks that the level of the data privacy is the same, at least the same as in the EU. So it's basically safe to transfer the data to those countries. Well, US is not on that list. China is not on that list, obviously. So you would need to have some other means in order to transfer the personal data. So what we recommend is that if you have one of these cases where you have a collaborator or you would need to transfer the personal data outside European Union and the country is not in that list, you would need to contact your school's lawyer to help you with ensuring the GDPR compliance of the transfer and help you with making the needed documents. And it's also a really good idea to really see and pay attention to the participant documents just to make sure that the transfer is documented in good way.
Yeah. One country that fortunately has that adequacy decision is the UK. So we have a lot of research collaboration with the UK, even though they are not in the EU, and that country has an adequacy decision. So that makes it easier to share with the UK universities.
Yeah, because UK has, it's almost copied GDPR. We actually call it UK GDPR because it's so similar. But yeah, you can find the list on the European Commission's website. And the legal counsels will help you if you have a tricky case. But these are kind of doable if you know it before you start collecting the data. But what kind of questions I also receive myself is that the data has already been collected, the participants have been informed, and after all that, you have this really interesting researcher outside European Union that you would like to transfer the data to. So in those cases, we really don't have any tricks for you to sort of solve the issue. So the issue is that no agreement will fix the issue. So if the participant has not been informed about transferring the personal data outside EU, we don't have, unfortunately, any magical agreements that would simply fix the situation with the party who the personal data would be transferred to. Yeah. So you need to know it.
Yeah. That's why we make it, it's very important to plan and think of the possibilities. For example, if you have collaborators in the USA, because those questions where the only answer is unless we invent time machine and go back in time and draft a privacy notice to include these uses, there's nothing we can do. And like Annina said, we don't have the magic, we don't have the time machine, so we only have this advice of plan the life cycle of the data carefully.
Yeah, and in some cases, you could obviously contact each and every one of the participants and ask for new consent, but obviously that is massive work because you may have hundreds and hundreds of participants. So that's not an easy option either, to ask a new consent and inform each and every participant about the new transfer. So this is really important to keep in mind when you plan and write this privacy notice, that it actually has quite an influence what you write here in the privacy notice. And then what we have here as option 3 is sort of like, again, to be on the safe side, if we would have a case where the peer review process again or publishing would require transferring the personal data outside EU or European Economic Area. So we suggest you to include this clause, again, to be on the safe side if this unusual situation happens where you actually need to transfer or show the data which is regarded as personal data. Okay, section 7. This is more of on the technical side. So the purpose of this section is to tell the participant how and where the personal data is actually stored or processed. The first subsection is protection of manual material. So basically, if you still have some data on paper, we still have many cases where the consent forms, for example, they are actually asked on paper. So here you would need to describe and tell how you will be storing the consent forms, which are on paper. Usually the answer is something like in locked cabinet in the PI's office or something like that, really simple. And then the next subsection is the information processed in the IT systems. And again, here we have tried to make your life as easy as possible because we have basically written this section ready for you. So we have just a really general clause about that the personal data is processed in secure IT systems, which are approved by Aalto University and suitable for personal data. But again, if this is not applicable for your case, for example, we have cases where actually, for some reason, the data is not stored in the typical Aalto systems, or if the parties act as joint controllers and the data is not actually stored in Aalto University systems, you still need to edit this section. So if you have any unusual plans to store the data, for example, you would need to explain it in here. So this is just, again, a general clause that is still applicable for most cases, but you still need to pay attention if your case is somehow different. And the last subsection is where the research data is archived. The most common mistake here is that people mix this with just simply storing the data in Aalto University systems, but this is the previous subsection. So this means that if you store the personal data in Aalto systems, but this last section means that if you are archiving the data to some kind of data repositories, so it's completely different from just keeping the data in Aalto systems in order to conduct your study. So if you don't have any plans to actually give the data to any repositories, then you can just delete this entire last section. You don't need that in this case. Maria, do you have anything to add to the repository thing? I know
Yeah.
this is your specialty.
Yeah, it's actually Zenodo. I just noticed there is a spelling mistake. So,
Okay.
yeah, the restricted access in Zenodo has been used for this purpose. For example, if it's and usually then it's pseudonymized personal data. So usually for the archived data, you would really try to minimize. So it would be data where you have minimized the identifiers from the raw data, and you can consider this option.
Yeah, but also if it's fully anonymized, so not regarded as personal data anymore, then you can actually also put it in fully open repositories.
Yeah.
But yeah, only anonymized.
If you are able to achieve that, but that's quite difficult.
Yeah, but in some cases that may be possible. Yeah. Okay. Then section 8. So now we're coming to the sort of end of the life of the personal data. So in this section, you need to explain when are you deleting the personal data. So under GDPR, it's unfortunately not possible to keep the data forever or keep it forever because you can never be sure how long you are interested in using the data. So you can't use those kind of phrases that the data will be kept forever, or you can't say that the data will be kept as long as you feel that it's interesting, or as long as necessary, because this is way too vague. But we again have examples written for you here. So in the option 1, because also what's really important to note that you don't need to, or you don't, usually it's not recommended to delete the entire data at the same time. For different data sets or pieces of information, you actually in most cases have different times when you deleted it. So for example, in here, consent forms with name and contact information, in most cases, you don't actually need them as long as you need the actual research data. So you can delete those when you don't need them anymore. And you actually also should delete them when you don't need them anymore. Again, we already discussed about audio recordings and the written transcripts. So in most cases, once the transcription is done, you don't need the audio anymore and you can delete the audio. So basically then the audio recording has different retention time than the other data. But again, you can keep it if you need it. So basically, we also have studies where it's really important to, for example, keep the video, or the researchers are really interested in also analyzing the facial features. So in those cases, it actually might be needed to also keep the video or audio if they want to really interpret the voice that the participants are using. But in those cases as well, you need to just only keep the data that you actually need. So as Maria stressed out earlier, we never say that no, you can't process or collect personal data as your research, but you need to have a reason for it. So you can't collect or keep any data just to be sure, or so no extra data is allowed to be kept. There always must be a reason why you are keeping a piece of personal data from the participant. And then we have some other categories. Again, if these are not applicable for your research, you can just delete them. So in some cases, the researchers delete the code key data, for example, if they aim at anonymizing the data. But please remember that just deleting the code key data does not make your data anonymized. But in some cases, they actually do delete the code key data earlier, and then they keep the other data set for a longer period of time. What we actually use as the deletion time or the retention time of the research data itself. So in most cases, this is the pseudonymized actual research data. So we have already, in most cases, maybe deleted all the data that has been collected just for practicalities, because in most cases you only need the name and contact information and stuff like that for practicalities. But this is now the actual research data that you will be using to do the research and analyze this piece of data set. So what we use in many cases is this kind of sort of open time, because when you start collecting the data, it's sometimes impossible to know when the publication will be finished or when the analyzing and writing the article will be finished. So it's possible to use this kind of timeline that you sort of bound the time to the last publication where the data has been used. So here it says that research data containing personal data is, again, now there is this phrase, if you want to use it for further research, so not just this research study, so that it can be used for a research in the same scientific discipline. And then the last sentence is that the data is deleted after 5 years since the last publication where the research data has been used and exploited. Because this is fine, because you have at least some kind of determination when the data will be deleted. So this is completely different than using phrases like the data will be kept as long as necessary, because this is too vague. But if you have some kind of timeline set when the time starts running, for example, here, you would need to see that, okay, well, this data has now not been used for 5 years. After that, you deleted it. But obviously, this is a really big responsibility, because the researcher is actually responsible of evaluating the data. Is this still relevant? Has this been used in any research project for years? So this is the responsibility of the researcher to actually evaluate if the data is relevant or used anymore. Okay, we're slowly coming to an end. So the second last section is about rights of the participant. So under the GDPR, I think this is the first section where you don't need to make any edits. So we have fully written this ready for you to use. So this is fully based on GDPR. So we just need to tell the participant and list all the rights that the participants have. So the first is obviously receiving information on the processing of their personal data, which is now we're trying to fulfill that liability with this privacy notice. So this is the information that the participant receives from the processing. The second is that they will have right to access the personal data. So if a participant contacts you and asks that they would like to have the data about themselves, you would need to disclose it to them. Then if there are any mistakes in the personal data regarding the participant, you will need to correct those. Then in some limited cases, the participants have rights to request that the processing is restricted, and they also may have right to object that they don't want their personal data to be processed. In scientific research, we have a little bit better situation, because, for example, if someone withdraws their consent, we may still use the data collected up until that point for the research study. So we don't need to delete the entire data concerning that one participant who does not want to participate anymore. So we can use everything that has been collected up until that point. And the second thing is that if we, for example, have already anonymized the data for regarding the participant, so it's not possible for us to identify a person or try to find the personal data of the single individual participant, we don't need to do that. So if we already have the data in a form where a single individual may not be recognized, we don't need to do basically anything. So we don't need to start aiming to make the data back in a form where the participant is recognizable from the data.
Yeah, we never have to ask for more. If somebody says that I'm Pekka, I want my data back, and we no longer know, we have, for example, 10,000 brain images, and we don't know which one is from Pekka. We don't have to remove that. So again, minimizing the personal data also gives you that security, and all the rights, and also this, that we don't ever have to ask for more information in order to fulfill the rights. This is all legislated in the binding legislation. That's why we say you don't have to change it, and actually you cannot change it. So these are the rights of the research participant in the binding legislation. We do have actually a process where you could do a data impact assessment and give it to the authorities before the process of using the personal data, but it's very complicated and we have never used it. So it's just, we just leave the rights as is. And usually the people who are wishing to participate in scientific research have a very positive view of scientific research. And in my 14 years, we have never had a case where at least I have not had, let's not say I have not, where somebody would, like, for example, all of a sudden start to objecting to the processing of personal data. So, but these are the rights, and if they do contact, we have later the contact address of the data protection officer, so they can contact her. But if they do contact you, don't say no, then transfer it to the legal counsel, or even more so to data protection officer, that request. If somebody requests you that they want to use these rights, which they have.
Yes. So now we head to section 10, which is the last section. Can you believe it? Hopefully everyone's still awake. So yeah, this is basically, this gives the participant the contact details of the controller. So if they want to exercise any of their rights, for example, as Maria just explained. So the basic case is obviously that Aalto University is the controller of the personal data. And then option 2 is about these joint controllers. So here, if you act as joint controllers, for example, with University of Helsinki or Helsinki Hospital, in those cases, you would need to list those partners here. And then we have, again, a clause ready for you to use, which is basically like that the parties will jointly determine the purposes and means of the processing, and therefore will act as joint controllers of the personal data. So just this is a really simple section to fill in. And then the person in charge of the study means if the participants have any questions about the research study itself, who they can contact. So any practical questions about the ongoing study. So basically, usually it's the PI or the coordinating researcher or some other person who the research group has agreed to be as the contact point. And then here you don't need to change anything or fill anything in. So basically here we have just the instructions of if the participants want to exercise any rights, or if they have any questions related to GDPR. So don't be afraid if the participants ask anything GDPR related, we will help you. You don't need to be able to answer everything. So our DPO will be the contact point there. to answer any of the questions, and will also help you if you need to gather any gather any data to be accessed by the participant, or if you have any other questions about the participant rights. And then the last section is that we just simply inform who is the authority in Finland, and tell that the participants also have right to lodge a complaint with the supervising authority, which in Finland is the Data Protection Ombudsman's office. And here is the website, the link.
Yeah. So
that was it.
That was it. So this is so easy. So now you can fill this privacy notice.
Yeah.
And, we encourage you to fill it. And if once you have filled it, you feel that there are things that you should discuss, then I advise in the School of Arts, and the other schools have other legal advisors. So then you can discuss with us. But please, really plan the study first and fill this, all the parts you can fill, because we are not researchers, and we cannot give you the answers to the most important questions.
So, so the privacy notice was just one document that needs to be drafted to the participants. Obviously, the GDPR does not require it to be in the written form, but anyone can imagine that if you start explaining orally that kind of information to the participant, it can be quite overwhelming and difficult. So we think that it's also easier to understand it by reading it. So it's the best way maybe to draft a private notice and give the information in written form. So, and as discussed, in most cases, the participants obviously give consent to participate in the research. And we also have a template for this purpose. But what we would really like to stress out is that the participation confirmation does not have to be in writing. So you can also ask it by using other means. It can be oral. So for example, before you start interviewing a person, you can just ask for them to orally confirm that they would like to participate and they have received sufficient information about the research study. Or if you are conducting, for example, a survey online, that could be just like ticking the box basically. So it can be also electronic consent. So you don't need to have a paper with handwritten signature from the participants. This is just one option, but we would like to show you this anyway. Maria, do you have anything to add?
No, that's the main thing. So name of the research study, and then as I explained, that I advise in the School of Arts, where we, for example, have interviews about architecture. So in those cases, if your name is published in the publication, then there is a section for that, but that's only selected in these specific instances. So again, remove that if you don't have this special case, and then you would only have these two sentences that you understand that participation is voluntary, and they can notify that they no longer wish to participate, but the information gathered up to that point is used as described in the privacy notice of the research study.
Yeah. And in addition to this, obviously, document, you would need to have information about the research study itself, so which Maria mentioned already in the beginning, so of all the practicalities. So before people give their consent to participate, obviously they need to be able to know what they are actually consenting from. So there you are able to tell what is the purpose of the research, the methods, how much does the participants need to use their time for this, and what actually happens in the research setting. And in that document, you usually also give information that the research participation is voluntary, and you may withdraw your consent anytime, and you give information if they receive any compensation, if they give any money or gift cards to the participants, that would also need to be noted. We don't have an explicit example of an information sheet, which is the common name of that document, because it varies a lot. There are very few clauses and sentences that we would be able to write ready for you, because each information sheet looks different, obviously, because each research study is so different, and we're not really able to give you a good example. So usually, if you're doing this for the first time, you can ask for advice or examples from more senior members in your research group or your supervisor. They usually are happy to help you with drafting the information sheet as well.
Yeah. So this participation consent or participation confirmation is meant for those cases where you, as we have advised, have chosen the scientific research as legal basis. And this is the ethical consent to participate. This is not the legal basis for personal data processing. So we are now away from the legally binding GDPR, and we are in the realm of research ethics with this document. So the privacy notice was about the obligations of GDPR, and also it is true that also research ethics requires giving this information, but the form and the actual wordings and all that needs to be included there is stated in the GDPR. And then here the consent to participate is not GDPR related. This is the ethical consent required by research ethics to make sure that the participation is voluntary, and it's informed consent that the participant has been given enough information so that he can truly choose to participate or not, and understand what the participation means.
Yes.
Yeah, we should stop recording and allow to open the mix for any questions, definitely.